Who wrote the book of Ruth? I have no idea. In Jewish tradition, they assumed that Samuel wrote both the books of Judges and Ruth. I don't think that actually works, but it's an old Jewish tradition. Since then, all sorts of proposals have been presented. Some people think it was a northern Israelite person from the 9th century. Some propose that this was even Tamar, David's daughter. There is a scholar who argues that the author was obviously sensitive to women's issues, so she assumes that the author of the book was probably a woman. Now, it could have been, I wouldn't rule that out, but just because it is sensitive to women's issues doesn't make that a convincing case. In any case, we know very little about literacy among women in that time. A bigger issue is, or a more common interpretation, is that this book was written in the Persian period, late in Israel's history. This is where critical scholarship tends to be. It assumes that since the book of Ruth is in the writings, the hagiographa, it was written long after the former prophetic books were written, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and also because of its concern with the ethnic issues of Ruth and her Moabite status. 8 times in the book, Ruth is identified as the Moabite. So a common opinion these days that it was written in the Persian period after the Judean exiles had come back and rebuilt the community in Jerusalem, particularly in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. They institute what shall we call it? A reform in which they force men to divorce all their non-Jewish Israelite wives. It's a very, shall we say, ethnocentric preoccupation. It's almost racist. And a lot of people find this book to be a counterweight to Ezra and Nehemiah's ethnocentrism. That's where a lot of people are today. When I read this book, though, I don't find a hint of that kind of agenda. Yes, Ruth is a Moabite, but there are other issues that are playing here. Now, one of the foremost commentators of this, on this book, Fred Bush, has argued that the book comes from the early post-exilic period, not as late as Ezra and Nehemiah, but somewhere perhaps after 538 BC, but he does so on the basis of the language. He finds features in the language, the Hebrew of Ruth, that are late biblical Hebrew and or are in fact Aramaic features. And based on the language, he argues for a later date. Now, I don't think that is completely convincing either, because when you think of a book that consists of 1,200 plus words, and there are only half a dozen or 8 words that show up as having this kind of influence, it's not a very strong case. I think we can just as easily answer that issue by proposing that the author lived in a region of Israel, whether it's within the southern kingdom or northern kingdom, but he lived within a region of Israel where there was contact with Aramaic-speaking people. I think the critical thing in determining the date is the opening line, in the days when judges judged, or I prefer, when chieftains governed. That identifies a particular period for the events of this case, but it also suggests that the book was written after the book that is dealing with that, namely the biblical book of Judges. In my interpretation, the biblical book of Judges was written in the early 7th century after the exile of the land of the northern kingdom to the Assyrians. The clue to this is found in Judges 18 at the end of the chapter. If Ruth was written after that, that makes a lot of sense to me. And so, we all speculate. My speculation is probably as grounded as any other, but I imagine this book coming out of the last, shall we say, decades of Judah's history by an author who was fascinated by the identity of the Davidic monarchy. Maybe it was written in the time of Josiah, in whose days the Davidic monarchy experienced a renaissance. It strikes me that the author probably knew the book of Micah, because in this book, on a couple of occasions, we have references to Bethlehem Ephrathah, expressions that appear in Genesis, which has a lot of influence on the book of Ruth, and they appear in Micah's prophecy of the little town of Bethlehem Ephrathah in Micah chapter 5. So I think the author knew the book of Judges, and he knew the prophecies of Micah. Whether they were collected in a book at this time or not, I don't know. But if we don't know the identity of the author, that doesn't trouble me one bit. Because in the ancient world, authors rarely identified themselves. We have hundreds of literary texts from Mesopotamia. We know the authors' names of maybe 3 or 4. That's all. Now, when scribes were copying texts, they regularly signed their names because of the need for accountability. But authors of texts in those days didn't sign their names. They weren't as concerned as we are today about copyright laws and credits and all the rest of that nonsense. So when we come to a biblical book, I don't stress out too much about identifying a particular author. There isn't a single book in the First Testament, the Hebrew Bible, that tells us explicitly who wrote the book. I assume the prophecies of Isaiah come from the prophet Isaiah, but that doesn't mean Isaiah wrote the book. Somebody else may have collected these. I think the closest we get is Ezekiel, which has an autobiographical flavor all the way through. So I don't expect these books to name the author. I expect them to remain anonymous because it is the message that counts, and who wrote it doesn't actually affect that issue. I think it's important for us to try to establish a context from which a book emerged, and that helps us interpret it, but who wrote it, I don't know. It doesn't matter much to me. But very early on in the history of God's people, they recognized this book as canonical scripture, and so do I.